This material will cover procedures for reducing problem behaviors. First of all, anytime you want to decrease a behavior, you have to target an appropriate behavior that you want to increase. Sometimes that behavior is simply going to be what it is you expect the student to do in that situation. Sometimes it's going to be an appropriate alternative behavior that serves the same function as a problem behavior. Either way, you never attempt to reduce a behavior unless you're attempting to increase a behavior at the same time. There are some guiding principles that we need to discuss when it comes to using reductive procedures. And we'll talk about each one individually. First of all, there's the principle of least intrusive alternative. You've heard about the principle of least restrictive educational placement. This is a parallel philosophy for behavioral interventions. Then we'll discuss the effectiveness criterion, issues related to consultation and permission with using different kinds of procedures, and then we'll talk more about functional alternative behaviors. When we talk about level of intrusiveness, there are generally 4 levels that we speak of. The least intrusive, and by intrusive we mean to what extent does this intervention impact on that person's typical freedoms or things that person usually has access to, or does this procedure restrict that person's movement, or does it cause any kind of stress or discomfort? The least intrusive is differential reinforcement, and here we mean using things like DRO, DRI, DRA, or DRL as a way to decrease behavior. That's the least intrusive method, and it's also a very effective method if it's used in combination with other things. The next intrusive method is extinction. Extinction is a little bit more intrusive than just using differential reinforcement for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you stop reinforcing a behavior that's been reinforced in the past, it does cause some stress or some frustration. You know this yourself. If you try to use a soda machine and it's not working, you get a little frustrated. If it's something that's really important to you and it all of a sudden doesn't work, it can be very frustrating. So there is that frustration reaction that we have when extinction is used. Another reason is that there's such a thing as an extinction burst. You get a temporary increase in a behavior when you use extinction. And this can expose the person to some risk, because if you inadvertently reinforce a behavior at this higher level, you can make a problem behavior worse. So you have to be very careful about using extinction. You have to know what you're doing. The key is you never use it by itself. If you use extinction, or if you stop reinforcing a problem behavior at that same time, you should be prompting the student to do something else and reinforcing that alternative behavior when it happens. Remember, extinction is not equivalent to ignoring a student. You can be interacting with the student and simply not reinforcing a certain behavior, and then you're using extinction. So redirection is a way to do that. With redirection, you're not directly responding to a problem behavior, but you're prompting or communicating to the student to do something else. When the student does that other behavior, then you deliver reinforcement. The next level up is removal of desirable stimuli or events. Another word for this is response cost. And this is a way of decreasing behavior by contingent on a behavior, you remove something that's valuable to the student. Does that sound familiar? It should, because we've discussed it before, only then we called it negative punishment. When you use negative punishment in the context of a structured program, we call it response cost. And then finally, the most restrictive intervention is presentation of aversive stimuli, or positive punishment. Positive punishment in the past or historically has been way overused in education. And sometimes things that have been intended to serve as punishers for students really have not been punishers at all. For example, suspension. That's typically a big gun we use in education. There are many instances when suspending a kid for several days does not function as an aversive stimulus and doesn't decrease the behavior. So With the advent of PBIS and other procedures, we're seeing move away from using positive punishment as a primary means of changing behavior, because by itself it's typically not very effective in producing long-term behavior change. Hopefully you've read the chapter in the book, and we've talked about each of these differential reinforcement strategies. They can be a little confusing because, well, they are all DR something. But there are big differences between them, and we'll talk about each one of them. Let's go back to extinction. Remember, extinction is when we stop reinforcing a behavior that's been reinforced in the past. And as we've said over and over again, it's not equivalent to ignoring someone. People do that often. They'll just stop attending to a kid altogether. The problem with that is often these kids will engage in appropriate behaviors that get ignored as well. So you're not ignoring everything, or you're not failing to reinforce everything. You're simply removing reinforcement for a specific behavior. Now, several things are important there. I use the term ignoring a lot. People, that's very embedded, and I'm just going to say that over and over again because that's a mistake I see people make very often. Ignoring a behavior will only serve to the purpose of extinction if your attention was the reinforcer for that behavior. Let me say that again. Ignoring a behavior will not result in extinction unless your behavior or your attention was the reinforcer that was maintaining that behavior to begin with. If the reinforcer is something else, you can ignore that behavior all day long and it's not going to change it. For example, if the behavior is maintained by escape from demands, and you ignore the kid, but the kid also ends up escaping a demand because of the behavior is going to continue. If the behavior is maintained by attention from other students, your ignoring it is not going to change it. It's not going to result in extinction. Or if the behavior is maintained by its own sensory consequences, as in the case of self-stimulatory behavior, ignoring it's not going to change it. You have to know what the reinforcer is, however, in order to use extinction. That's why a functional behavior assessment is really important. Now let's move to removal of desirable stimuli. And as I said before, we call that response cost. That's when we have a fine or a penalty. The most common way this is used is in the context of some kind of point system or level system or token system. So you're reinforcing a student with points or tokens. You've got certain behaviors that result in points being earned, and then when some behaviors happen, you take points away. This can be an effective component. However, it's overused. First of all, if you're going to use response cost, be very careful about how you use it. Don't overuse it. If you have so many fines and penalties that kids see their points getting whittled away to nothing, what you're going to do is you're going to decrease the motivating power of those points. Kids are not going to work really hard to earn points that they know are likely to just be taken away from them. So how is the appropriate way to use it? Use it for more serious kinds of behaviors. Things that are very serious, and you need to deliver a clear message to your students that this is not acceptable behavior. Don't do it for every minor little thing, but have maybe, for something really serious like aggression or, something that has been an issue that's been real critical with this kid. So only one or two behaviors would result in response cost, and even then I would say only if a kid continues after a warning. Another intervention we're going to talk about is timeout. Timeout is very misunderstood. The actual title of the intervention is called Timeout from Positive Reinforcement, and that's been shortened just to timeout, and people don't really understand where this intervention came from. So we're going to talk about what timeout means. And the definition for timeout is it's temporarily losing the opportunity to earn reinforcement contingent on an inappropriate behavior. That means when you engage in a behavior, the reinforcement switch gets turned off for a very short period of time. And during that time, the student can't earn reinforcement. So these are two important concepts: response cost and timeout. We spoke about the effectiveness criteria, and what does that mean? It means that when you're using interventions to decrease behavior, you do not move on to a more restrictive intervention unless you first tried an intervention that is less restrictive and it has not been effective. In practice, unfortunately, what this sometimes amounts to is people sort of going through the motions of doing interventions just to say they've done them. I've seen people develop reinforcement programs for kids and implement them just for a day or two, just to say that they did it so they can move on to some punishing procedure. And when you look at those reinforcement programs, you see they're really kind of lame sometimes. There's not a lot of effort in them. This is extremely unfortunate because having an effective positive reinforcement system is absolutely essential for any kind of intervention you're going to do. And it should be part of anything else. If you're going to have an intervention that's more restrictive, the backbone still needs to be some positive reinforcement system that is very well developed and consistently carried out. You also need data that shows the integrity of the intervention you developed. In other words, you're showing that you tried it with integrity, meaning that you put the effort into it that was required, and still the student's behavior didn't improve to the level it needed to. So you've got to have data to back it up. Also, when you use more restrictive kinds of interventions, you need to bring in people with the expertise required. As a classroom teacher, you may be an expert in behavioral interventions. You may be the primary person, but it's always good to have other people involved. Some school districts have any school district or program should have very clear policies and guidelines for behavior management procedures and the level of permission you need for different kinds of interventions. Be extremely familiar with the guidelines and policies of the program in which you're employed. Read the policy manual, know it. Don't expect other people to always point out the policy to you. You're responsible legally for following the policy, and it's your responsibility as a professional to know what's in there and to follow it. I've seen situations where things happened and people, teachers or other folks would say, well, I didn't know this was the policy. Nobody told me. It doesn't matter. If you've signed off that you're familiar with the policies, you're expected to follow them. If there is a behavior management committee or some other committee that is designed to oversee the implementation of behavior management practices, be sure that you know how this committee works. Hopefully you're going to be in a situation where a committee is actually involved in helping you develop an intervention. They're the best ones. And you can have the advantage of someone else coming in and actually doing some observations. I've been on a number of behavior management committees when I worked with different programs, and they were more problem solving than just regulating people. I think the best ones, again, are the ones that involve actually helping people develop interventions. So the bottom line here is know what the policies are, be sure you follow them for any intervention you're going to do. If your school district requires permission for timeout, then be sure you use it. We've talked about teaching a functional alternative, but it's worth mentioning again. Again, the only way you can really know what a functional alternative behavior is to do a functional behavior assessment. You need to know why the behavior is occurring so that you can teach the student another behavior or another way to get his or her needs met.